our journal Proletarian, number 23 in April 2008, had a headline which is just still, I think, extremely topical today. It says, Israel threatens a Holocaust in Gaza. Apparently without any irony, and 60 years after the Zionists began their forcible ethnic cleansing in Palestine, Matan Vellani, Israel's deputy defense minister, threatened then a Shoah, literally a disaster, a catastrophe, a Holocaust, if the Palestinians continued their resistance. I think true to their word, we can see with 480 to 500 Palestinians being killed in the last week alone due to direct military assaults upon Gaza, in addition to, as we've heard, all of their other economic and financial strangulation of the population who live there, that they actually are engaged in perpetrating another in a long line of massacres against the Palestinian people. The slaughter is indiscriminate and it's industrial in scale. It's perpetrated by fighter planes, by tanks, by attack helicopters, by F-16 fighter planes, and by artillery openly deployed against what is a civilian area, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and certainly in the Middle East, with, as we've said, 1.5 million people living in a strip of land that's 10 kilometers by 40. So particularly vicious has been the targeting of the democratically elected representatives of the Palestinian people, Hamas, and the blatant declaration that this campaign is about regime change. I was recently arrested, as Ella mentioned, at a protest outside the Israeli embassy. It was a demonstration against Israel's war crimes in Gaza. And while I was in police custody, I was reminded of just how tight is the vice-like grip that our media hold over the minds of people who anyway have a tendency not to be inquiring, as are many of the police. And it reinforced my understanding of how key is the propaganda ministry in the modern armamentarium of imperialism. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, famously stated, if you tell a big enough lie and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. But the rest of his quote is often not quoted. I think it's worth repeating. He said, the lie can be maintained only for such a time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. I think this goes a long way to explaining the role of propaganda and the reason that the police feel it's so necessary to come down hard on those who seek to break that propaganda and try and spread the truth about Palestine, amongst many other issues. The very complicity of the armies and agencies, whether the IDF or the British police, who are ultimately, as Jack said, who are ultimately the ones flying these magnificent machines, are the ones sent to do the bidding of the finance capitalists, are themselves psychologically dependent on the false proclamations of our media in order to rid themselves of guilt for their actions and carry out their perceived duty. The Nuremberg trials after World War II clearly established that those guilty of war propaganda are just as culpable as those pulling the trigger and carrying out the military acts. And that's as true for the US, the UK and Israeli armies of occupation deployed against Iraq, Afghanistan and the people of Palestine as it was for the German armies deployed against the peoples of Europe, Asia and Africa. There are a few popular prejudices which, though they're broken probably in many of the minds of the people attending this audience, I think we have to reckon with. And one is that it takes two to tango, that at best there's an implication that somehow there's an equivalency between the violence of the Palestinians and the violence of the Israelis. There's equal responsibility on each side. That's certainly the line generally put forward by the British media and state. And they put forward also the idea that Palestine has little to do with us, especially, and generally the conflict in the Middle East has little to do with us. Obviously we deplore violence because we're civilized people, but we cannot and we shouldn't intervene. However, we're told our sympathies lie with democracy, and Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, apart from, I've recently heard Bush and his wife referring to the newly created Quisling state in Iraq as a democracy as well, so they're in good company there, usually implying that whenever not only whenever Israel's war crimes are mentioned, they have to mention Qassam rockets being launched by Hamas and saying that they're equal, usually implying that Israel has been provoked by the Palestinians. Ultimately, Palestinians in particular, but Arabs in general, are a warlike people and they should generally be blamed. This analysis is obviously and must necessarily be totally divorced from all historical context and any real reference to facts on the ground, because otherwise it's simply impossible to reach such a conclusion by such an analysis. I might mention in passing that during the last 7 years, only 7 Israeli civilians have been killed by the rocket attacks, which are meant to be the justification for these actions, whereas in obviously the last week alone, 480, 500 Palestinians have been brutally done to death in the space of a week in Gaza alone. The Geneva Convention also upholds the right to self-determination and self-defense against occupation. It explicitly states in Article 54 that starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. That is obviously precisely what is happening in Gaza, and therefore it's no exaggeration when we say that Israel is a perpetrator of war crime and is contravening these treaties. But while the British imperialism holds a monopoly on the media, its grip on, as I say, on the minds of people who are uninquiring is strong. And I think the police are a typically good example. When they arrested me, they asked me, are you Muslim? I said, no, I'm not a Muslim. So well, why do you support Palestine? And I told them, well, because I was opposed to injustice everywhere. Shouldn't they be? To which they smugly replied, well, what about the violence of the Palestinians? That prejudice is so strong, it was enough for them to hold on to and justify what they're up to. But that's the logic of the oppressor, and I told them so. But we, I think, should agree amongst ourselves that there can be no condemnation of the legitimate resistance to overwhelming oppression and exploitation. If humanity is to have any future, we must encourage, support, and applaud it.